Great. So hi, everybody. Thanks for coming today to our weekly AFMS seminar. It's my pleasure to introduce our seminar speaker, Dr. Christina Vanderwel. So Christina she's an associate professor in the Aerodynamics and Astronautics Department at the University of Southampton. She's going to give a quick bio, but I'll just quickly say she did her PhD at the University of Ottawa in 2014, and she specializes in experimental fluid mechanics with a particular interest in turbulent flows and mixing. But I'll leave the rest of it up to you, Christina, so please take it away.
Great, thank you. First of all, it's really my honor to be presenting my work on urban flows at the Australasian Fluid Mechanics Seminar Series. I've been really heard about this seminar series for a long time and been looking forward to presenting. And I came to visit Melbourne for the TSFP conference back in 2015. And since then, I've been working on ways to come and visit Australia again. And I thought in 2019, I finally had some plans in the bag to come visit Kapil Chwan at Sydney to collaborate on some experiments on dispersion in boundary layers. But since COVID hit, I don't know when that's going to be possible. So I feel like this is my consolation prize to at least give a seminar remotely. And it's the morning for me here in Southampton. But thank you for everyone who's logged in during the evening in Australia to listen to me. So I thought I'd first give a little bit of background about myself and how I got to where I am. So this will give you a little bit of perspective on my research. So let's start. So here's a bit of a timeline of my bio. As Kat said, I did my graduate studies at the University of Ottawa, and I worked with Stavros Tavlaris, and I was lucky enough to have a full ride from a national scholarship. So that meant I got to work on a quite fundamental project studying coherent structures in uniformly sheared turbulence and how they affect dispersion. And this was an excellent introduction to fluid mechanics. And after I graduated, I decided to go to Southampton as a postdoc to work with Bharath Ganapathy Subramani on boundary layers. And this is when I worked on secondary flows. So this is this work here, if I could circle it, there we go, which I know some people in Australia are also working on. So together, Bharath and I came up with a project to combine our expertise and to look at dispersion in boundary layers. And I won a Marie Curie fellowship to study this. So that was in 2015. And subsequently, I was hired permanently as a lecturer. So that was a very good year, about 5 years ago. So more recently, I have some new funding to apply this sort of line of research, simulating urban air pollution. So this is where we are at now. And I'm happy to say that I'm also now an associate professor at Southampton. So that's a timeline of my career path, but I also feel like it won't be complete without mentioning that for the past 5 years, I've also had this other side project called Kids. So this is Royce and Jack. They're 4 and 2 now, but this picture is a bit old, and I just thought it was incomplete talking about myself without mentioning them, as they've also been an important part of my journey to where I am now. So I could talk about them at length, but today I'm going to focus on urban flows and air pollution and the latest work that I've been doing at Southampton. So here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'm going to talk about the current challenges for modeling urban flows. I'll then discuss 2 case studies that we've looked at in our lab. The first one is studying idealized fractal cities. And the second one is looking at a scale model of a real Beijing neighborhood where there are new tall buildings being built. And after we talk about the case studies, I'll wrap up with what we learned from these studies, and I'll conclude with the outlook for ongoing and future work at Southampton. So why do we study urban air pollution? Well, presently, there's a push to improve our ability to model air quality in cities. And according to the World Health Organization, more than 80% of people living in urban areas are exposed to unsafe levels of air pollution. With more and more people living in cities now, And the latest figure I saw was about more than half the world population lives in cities. This is obviously a large impact of the health of our global population. So modeling is not only important for forecasting air quality, but also for making policy decisions. And I'm interested in this problem because it's essentially a huge fluid dynamics problem. You can consider the atmospheric boundary layer as essentially a turbulent boundary layer over a rough wall, where the buildings and the trees are essentially the roughness. And when you look at it this way, you can see how knowing the wind profile, so sketched here, sort of whoosh, that's going to be important for predicting urban climates, for predicting wind comfort, for predicting pollutant dispersion, which is what we're going to talk about today, wind loading, among other applications. So the typical approach for numerical weather prediction is to divide up the world into a grid, both horizontally and vertically. And typically the grid cells are on the order of 10 kilometers, but I know the UK unified model does get as refined as around 1 kilometer sometimes. And then they look at each grid cell and look at the type of surface roughness in that grid cell, and basically classify it as, say, for example, tall buildings, industrial, forest, farmland, desert, or water, and look at the mean properties of the surface in that grid cell. And the vertical wind profile of the wind is then essentially determined based on those surface parameters, mean surface parameters, so assuming homogeneity inside that grid cell, as well as the stability conditions. So that's typically the approach now. And you can see that there might be some problems with that when you change the scale. So by assuming everything is homogeneous within the grid cell, you figure out the log law that describes the mean velocity profile above this cell. And a good portion of the lower atmospheric boundary layer can be described by the log law in this layer. And also turbulent fluxes are fairly constant in this layer, so that helps modeling too. But below the roughness sublayer, so in amongst the buildings and inside the urban canopy layer, I would say that all bets are off. So as wind patterns are strongly dependent on the local topography. And this is a sketch from Fernando, their annual review of fluid mechanics paper, showing the log law region and the roughness sublayer region near where the buildings are. And some people assume an exponential wind profile in this canopy region, but I think that's a bit of wishful thinking, because really everything depends on the wakes of these individual buildings. So in meteorology, the different scales that we talk about are summarized as in this picture. The mesoscale at the top, that's the big picture. And the approach here is to assume that the city is kind of just a uniform homogeneous roughness, and we know what the log law looks like above this. And you can see that you don't get any of the details near the ground and around the buildings from this big picture. If you zoom right into the buildings, we would call that the microscale. And you would be looking at the individual wakes of the buildings. And this reminds me of the classic wall-mounted cube studies, say by Martinuzzi and by Castro, for example. But in between is the local scale, where it's quite difficult to model everything that's going on. The wakes from multiple buildings might be interacting, and there might be urban canyons channeling the flow. And unfortunately, this is the typical scale that urban air pollution is transported. And so a recent UK report highlighted this current need for new frameworks designed to treat heterogeneous surface exchange at scales ranging from 100 meters to kilometer scale in this local scale range. And they identified using large eddy modeling and wind tunnel modeling to fill this gap in the knowledge. So today, I'm going to be talking about what we've been doing with about this with wind tunnel modeling. So I'm going to talk about two case studies The first one is going to be looking at idealized fractal models that I came up with. And the second one is going to be looking at a real Beijing tall building model. So the first case study was aimed at answering the question, how well do homogeneous surface assumptions work for multi-scale distributions? So as I said before, usually you take your grid size or your grid cell and classify the surface in some way. And typically that's done by looking at the average frontal solidity of the buildings compared with the plan form solidity of the buildings in that cell. And you would then estimate your flow from those parameters. So to test this, we designed some idealized fractal cities. And this model here, the CAD model I've shown, is based on the Sierpinski carpet fractal. It has the biggest cubes are height 10 millimeters, and then the next size is half that, so 5 millimeters, and then 2.5, and then 1.25 millimeters. And they're arranged in this Sierpinski carpet fractal pattern. And the number of cubes follows a power law. So what you end up getting is actually the total area covered by each size of cube is the same. And what I did is I took this multi-scale fractal picture and randomized the arrangement. So I wanted to see how keeping the same number of cubes, but changing their arrangement would change the flow. So I have 4 random arrangements of this same idealized city. The plan form solidity remains the same, but the frontal solidity changes depending on the arrangement, as some cubes are shielded from others. And so patch A here has the largest frontal solidity, and then as we go B, C, and D, you can see D with the flow going from left to right. A lot of the buildings are shielding each other, and so that one has the least frontal solidity. So these are the idealized cities I tested, and I tested them in the wind tunnel. I did wind tunnel testing in our 3-foot by 2-foot wind tunnel using a force balance to directly measure the drag of the patch, and PIV to measure the flow both in a streamwise plane and in a stereo cross plane in the wake of the patch. So here's the patch here. We have a streamwise plane, a stereo plane downstream, and this is the force balance. And I'll just note that so our wind tunnel goes at about 15 to 30 meters per second. And with the height of the cube being 1 centimeter, this gives us a Reynolds number based on the height in the range of 10 to 20,000. I also did water tunnel testing. I took the exact same patch that I used in the wind tunnel, put it in the water tunnel, and the water tunnel lets me introduce fluorescent dye as a proxy for air pollution. And I use planar laser-induced fluorescence, or PLIF, to track that concentration. And when you take the exact same model from the wind tunnel to the water tunnel, obviously we can't run our water tunnel at 10 to 30 meters per second. The maximum speed in the water tunnel is about 1 meter per second, but the density is higher. So the Reynolds number ends up being not too different from the wind tunnel Reynolds number. Here in this case, it was about half. But what we know from studies of flows over buildings and in cuboids is that typically for Reynolds numbers beyond about 5,000, we expect some Reynolds number independence. So I'm not too worried about the difference in Reynolds number here, and expect the results to be comparable. So let's look at the results now. Here are the drag measurements in the wind tunnel. The force balance measured the force presented here in grams. So here's the drag on the y-axis, and I varied the wind speed to get a range of Reynolds numbers, as I said, between 10 and 20,000. And we have 5 lines corresponding to the 4 random arrangements and the 1 organized Sierpinski pattern arrangement. And we can see for all the cases, the drag goes up with Reynolds number, as you would expect. So let's plot this as a coefficient of drag instead. So here's the exact same data, but plotted now as a coefficient of drag, and we can see the Reynolds number independence here. The plots are pretty flat, and we can see that the red plot, the red curve has the highest coefficient of drag, and that's the patch A with the largest frontal solidity. And the orange curve has the lowest coefficient of drag, and that's patch D with the smallest frontal solidity. So let's plot these average coefficient of drags versus solidity, and we get this curve here. So you can see that the 4 randomized patches, A, B, C, D, fall quite nicely on the curve that's predicted by theory. And the outlier we have is the Sierpinski carpet arrangement, funny enough. So I thought that was a bit of a surprise. First of all, nice to see that the arrangements do follow the curve predicted by theory based on the solidity, but interesting to see that when the cubes are arranged in some sort of organized fashion with blocks and streets, that this is an exception to the rule. So that was the first thing we learned. And let's look now at the velocity maps we measured. So here's a nice picture showing the some instantaneous results, and it's highlighting the planes that I measured. So I have the Streamwise plane through the center of the patch, and then the cross-stream stereo PIV plane in the wake of the patch. And you can see, well, here the free stream is in red, and the patch is definitely having some effect, slowing down the flow, which you can see in the blue contours. Let's zoom in here and look at these results in more detail. First, looking at the Streamwise measurements. So I've plotted here representative maps of the velocity deficit and the turbulence intensity around patch B. This is patch B. And the velocity deficit was calculated by taking the absolute velocity map and subtracting it from the map I measured without any patch present, so the smooth wall. And this lets us directly see the impact of the patch on the flow. And looking at this plot, we can see there seems to be an initial deflection around the leading edge of the patch, and then an internal boundary layer forms as a reaction of the flow to the rough patch. The plot below is the turbulence intensity, and we can see that obviously the patch kicks up some turbulence, and the boundary of the turbulence plot is almost identical to the boundary from the velocity deficit plot, so that's encouraging. If we plot the average velocity profile, so over these patches, in inner wall units, we can see that even though it's definitely not an equilibrium flow, they can be roughly approximated by log laws, and you get a shift in the profiles. You get this delta U plus corresponding with the increased drag from the patches that have more drag. So we see patch A has the most delta U plus compared with just a rough base without any patch. Now let's look at the velocity measured in the wake. So again, here I'm plotting the velocity deficit behind the 5 patches. The organized patch at the top, and then A, B, C, D going down. And we see that the wake is larger for the patches with greater frontal solidity. And clearly the narrowest patch D has the narrowest wake. And integrating these wakes gave the same trend as the drag measurements that I've just copied here. So you can see that you can see it by eye, really, that the size of the wakes increases for the patches that have more drag. So that was interesting to see as well. Now let's look at what the concentration does. So I have a ground level point source upstream of the patch. So it's about here that the fluorescent dye was injected in the water tunnel. And this top picture is the instantaneous concentration map, and you can see it showing the sort of billowy, flappy edge boundary of the concentration as it's passing through the urban canopy. On the bottom is the average concentration map, and I've plotted this in log scale just so we can see it a little bit better. And what you can see is that it's really this first building. It seems to kick up the concentration, and then what we have is sort of, there's a kink in the concentration profile, and the boundary of it then grows sort of steadily over the patch. So I wanted to compare the boundary from the concentration with the boundary from the internal boundary layer from the velocity maps, and this is in this plot here. So we can define the boundary of the plume in two ways, either from the contour line. So contour line would be about where the light blue is about 0.5% of the source concentration. And I said it was a log scale. So 0.5% is actually a good number to pick as the boundary. And this is the red curve I've plotted here. The other way to measure plume width is to use the half width. So that would be the second central moment of the concentration profile. But it doesn't actually make sense to do that when there's buildings present, because you end up getting essentially a bunch of zeros that you put in the calculation. So I could only plot that beyond the patch. So here's the plume half width plotted beyond the patch. And I've compared it with the internal boundary layer thickness, which is this yellow curve. And what I think is really interesting is that the trends are very similar. And it looks to me that the internal boundary layer that you see in the velocity maps does sort of like restrict the spreading of the plume, in my opinion. And I think there's some traction here in how the velocity and concentration profiles are related. And you'd expect this due to Reynolds' analogy, but I think there's some room for further work here. So just to summarize what we learned from these idealized fractal city studies was that the surface morphology wasn't too bad, actually, at predicting the trends of the results, except for when there was an organized pattern. And in my opinion, I would imagine this would actually be the majority of real cities, because I mean, often buildings are usually organized along streets and blocks. So this does raise a flag for using this approach for real city predictions. And then secondly, we saw that the internal boundary layer does appear to somehow modulate the extent of the dispersion. And this is something that I want to be looking into more. And so you might have seen the results of these studies before. So they're published in Boundary Layer Meteorology and also from the TSFP conference that was in Southampton in 2019. Now, let's look now at the Beijing tall building model, a real city model. And these are unpublished results, so you get to see them first. So the objective of this work was to see the impact of a tall building on the flow, structure, and dispersion. This work was in collaboration with Sue Grimmon's team at the University of Reading and Martin van Rooijk's team at Imperial College London. And we compared our experiments that we did in the water tunnel with LES done at Imperial. Here is a CAD model of the real neighborhood and the tall buildings in question. You can see there's quite a few of them that were being built in this neighborhood, and we want to see the impact of that on the flow structure and the air quality. Another question we had that we were trying to answer in this study is to compare the effect of different model sizes, because this is a question that we had when we were setting up the study. Well, what scale should we be putting the model in the water flume? So we tested two scales. here, and we actually printed a model half the size of the other model, and the Reynolds number is in roughly the same range as our previous studies. So here's a sketch of that setup. Again, it was in the same water tunnel that we did in the previous study, but this time we did simultaneous PIV and PLIF measurements. So we had 2 cameras for PIV that stitched the particle images together to get a nice wide velocity map, and then 1 camera for PLIF to measure the fluorescent dye. So the fluorescent dye is injected upstream of the patch and gets transported across the patch. In the image on the bottom right here, this is a photograph of the patch in our water flume being illuminated by that laser sheet from above. And this image in the top right here is showing the acrylic plate that we use actually to allow the laser sheet to pass through the free surface. And it means without that plate there, the laser sheet might get refracted by little waves in the free surface. And so it's just lowered to the same height as the water, and essentially acts like a glass bottom boat, is what I call it. So again, this is not too different from our study before, except that we have the velocity and the concentration measured at the same time. So let's look at the results. So in this case, we're looking at a streamwise velocity measurement in the streamwise plane right through the center of the patch. So I've tried to highlight this with a green shading in the CAD model and a white line in this top view of the city. On the top here, we have the mean velocity, and below is the turbulence intensity, essentially. And the measurements, as I said, are in the center plane. And I just want to point out here that the first building that you see in the map is actually in front of the measurement plane. So it's making a shadow here. The first building that's actually in the measurement plane is this second one. Sorry if I'll try to sketch it a little bit better. And what we can see is that the flow clearly impacts this building. So you imagine that it passes past this one, impacts this building, and then gets deflected upwards. Red was not a good pen choice there, but hopefully you can see that clearly there. So the rooftop shear layer that forms from this first building completely dominates the flow. And you can see this structure in the turbulence map as well. So the flow seems pretty calm until it hits the first building, which kicks it up and creates this rooftop shear layer and a whole lot of turbulent activity. And so this first building is completely dictating the flow, and the features, I think, are not too different than you would expect from a single isolated building. This sketch highlights the main flow structures you would expect to see in the wake of an isolated cuboid. This is from a paper by Wang in 2006. And I think what we're picking up here is essentially the tip vortices from the top of the building, maybe some activity at the base. And while there might be spanwise vortex shedding along the center of the building, we're not picking that up in the 2D PIV measurement. So I think what we see is these tip vortices that are creating this rooftop shear layer, which you can see in the mean and in the turbulence maps. So how does this affect the air quality and air pollution transport? Here are the PLIF measurements. The top image is the mean concentration map, and the bottom image is the turbulent scalar flux, which is calculated by multiplying the velocity fluctuations by the concentration fluctuations in the synchronized instantaneous images. So what we see is that the concentration boundary, again, has a similar shape to the velocity map. It seems to be, carrying through and then hits this tall building and immediately gets spread upwards by the action of the rooftop shear layer. And you can see that in the scalar flux map, that the rooftop shear layer seems to be the dominant mechanism for vertical exchange. So that's really cool, I think. Let's now compare the experimental results with the LES. While we did our best to match the flow conditions between the experiment and the simulation, there were some slight differences to the incoming friction velocity and the velocity profile. So actually, the fact that the results here are so similar not only shows us that our methods are quite good, but also that the results, I think, are not too sensitive to the incoming conditions. And I think this is because the flow is dominated by the tall building. So here's the experiment velocity map, just copied from the previous slide. And below is the LES measurement. And you can see here, well, the LES doesn't have that shadow of that first building in the way. And we can see that indeed the flow does seem to be diverted around this first building, kicked up and creating this rooftop shear layer. Here are the two profiles. So, because it's hard to tell by the maps, they look very similar. If we draw the profiles at 2 delta and 2.5 delta, we have the experiment in black lines, the LES in blue lines at these 2 points. And actually, the match is pretty good. They're a little bit off in magnitude in the sort of near wake of the building, but further down, they match fairly well. And so this is supposed to be 0. If I did draw a line here at 0, we can see that both methods predict the same reversed flow at this point in the flow. So I think that's very good and encouraging. Here are the concentration measurements, again with the experiment on the top and the LES on the bottom. And this time, if we look at the profiles, well, first, if we look at the maps are pretty consistent. We see the flow impacts this first building and definitely gets diverted above into this rooftop shear layer. The profiles, on the other hand, are a little bit off in magnitude, but the boundary of the concentration very clearly matches. You can see the kink is at the same point in the experiment and in the LES. And I think that's very encouraging, showing that both methods predict the location of this rooftop shear layer and the consequences of it very well. So the last thing we wanted to compare is the effect of the size of the model. So that we're now looking at the effect of the choice of scale in our experiment. And as I said, we had this conversation about what the best scale was to use, and that's why we thought we'd test it by just 3D printing another model at half the size of the first one. So the plots on the left are the same plots that you've seen already, and the plots on the right are half that scale. So the scale is of the model is half as large, but it's zoomed in here so that we can compare the 2 results side by side. Now, of course, if you half the scale, the Reynolds number halves, but as I said, the Reynolds number is still around 7,000, so roughly in this Reynolds number independent region. The other effect is that the incoming boundary layer looks twice as thick when you half the model scale. Not only that, but the source size looks twice as big because we kept the same wall injection source of dye. So looking at the results, can we see this in the results? Well, I think you can hardly tell the difference in the velocity maps. Again, both of them show the location of the shear layer, starts at the first building, in no matter what scale you have. So here's that first building. And again, in the scalar flux maps, it's showing the dominant scalar flux is in this outer region as well, based from this first building. But I think you can see a difference in the concentration maps. So really the difference is in the near source region. So as I said, the source, while here it's maybe the boundary is a little bit lower, when the scale of the model is half the size, the incoming source looks twice as big. And I think that's quite an important thing to think about, is the relative size of the source. Now, fortunately, the flow downstream and beyond the first buildings does seem to still be dictated completely by the shear layer created at the tip of that building, and the results are not too different in this downstream region. So there you go. That's what we learned about the model scale. So just to summarize what we learned from this case study is that, firstly, the rooftop shear layer seems to be a dominating feature that drives the vertical fluxes. And linking this idea back to the original research question about whether assuming average homogeneous surface conditions make sense, well, I think clearly this shows that the presence of the tall building seems to completely dictate the outer flow. And so no, if you averaged out the tall building and had sort of like a median height to estimate your surface conditions, you wouldn't get the flow features that we're seeing here in the measurements. And the location and the height of the tall building does seem to be particularly important for determining the vertical fluxes. What's more is that the flow around the tall building doesn't seem too sensitive to incoming flow conditions, unlike perhaps the near wake or near source features, the features closest to the ground. And lastly, that we found out the relative source size does seem to have an influence, and is something that we need to look more into, I think. So we're nearly done writing this up, and hopefully it will be published this year. So what are we working on now? First, I'm excited to tell you about the new facilities that have been built over the past year. Here are some pictures of the brand new water tunnel on the left and the brand new boundary layer wind tunnel on the right. And these facilities are replacing our old facilities, and they're now located at our new Boulderwood campus, which is just up the street from our main campus. So if you visited here, it's actually just like a not even 10-minute walk away. But this new campus co-locates all of our experimental fluids facilities together. The water tunnel, here we see me and the PhD and postdocs together going hooray, because it finally got built. It's about the same spec as the old water tunnel we had, but it's actually 2 meters longer, just about 2 meters longer than the previous one. So it's going to be even better for doing these sort of boundary layer studies. And the new wind tunnel is way longer than our old one. The test section is upstairs. So in the picture, you're seeing the test section. And then it's ducted through a hole in the ground, hole in the floor. So that's this corner here. And the fan section is downstairs. So that lets us have just a huge test section. And again, this is going to be fantastic for the boundary layer research that we're doing at Southampton. So one of the things that I'm going to be doing in the water tunnel so that we can continue our work on urban flows is, so Desmond Lim is the postdoc working with me, and he's working with the PhD students to design a new rough false floor. And this will help us generate thicker incoming boundary layers and better simulate atmospheric flows and test larger models in the water tunnel. So this setup is pretty common in wind tunnels, but I'm not too aware of too many other water tunnels that use Irwin spires and roughness. So I'm really quite excited about this being built this summer. And the big project that we're all working towards in this fellowship, and so here are the people working with me, is we're going to be modeling Southampton. We're working on pushing the domain size that we can manage beyond just the neighborhood scale towards the city scale and in between. And so here's a map of Southampton and a CAD model of the docks region and the side view of the city. And the CAD model is based on Ordnance Survey data that we have. So Matthew is the PhD student focusing on the CFD aspect, and his main supervisor is my colleague Zhengtong Zi, and I'm the co-supervisor. And then Tom here is the PhD student focusing on the experiments. So I'm the same main supervisor for Tom, and Zheng Tong is the co-supervisor for him. And then Desmond Lim is a postdoc supporting all the experiments that we're doing. So I guess all I can say about that is to please watch this space for further work on urban flows. And then this is my last slide. The last thing I wanted to promote is that I'm currently working on co-authoring a new textbook on turbulence with Ian Castro, and it's due out in the next year. And it's based around the turbulence module that I currently teach at Southampton, and Ian also used to teach before he retired. So if you want to talk to me about turbulence or any other research I'm involved in, please, I'm happy if you get in touch via Twitter or by email. And I'm always happy to talk about turbulent structures, atmospheric flows, mixing and dispersion, or secondary flows, or anything turbulence related. So I think with that, I'll end there and thank everyone who's been listening.
Great, thank you so much, Christina. That was a fabulous talk. Those experimental facilities you mentioned look really exciting for the future, so have to keep an eye out on what you do next. We do have some time for questions. If you're in the audience and you want to ask a question, feel free to just unmute your mic and go ahead, or you can raise your hand. Oh, so we already have someone raising their hand. Kapil, go ahead.
Oh, good to see you.
Hi, Christina. Good to see you too. Sorry you couldn't come here, but we'll get you here soon. Thanks for a fantastic talk, and coming from someone who works in the area, I'm really glad to see the systematic work that you're doing towards investigation. So great work. The question I had is that we ultimately aim to predict this numerically, the dispersion problem. So in the industry, what kind of accuracy are we looking for our predictive models?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think there's just a lot of room for improvement in general, really. So as I said, current trends for filling in this sort of local scale question is using sort of more and more complicated CFD and LES, but you can't do that for every situation. So yeah, I think there's room for maybe using some machine learning to improve our models based on experiments. But as some sort of threshold for how do we know when we've done a good job, I don't know.
Okay, I feel the same, because from what I see is that it's a site-specific problem, because if the geometry changes, your dispersion changes, the local dispersion at least. So if you want to take one study and apply to something else, you will have to increase your margin of error. So it's something that I keep thinking, and then maybe we can talk about that later on too. But thanks for the nice talk.
I agree, it is definitely site-specific. And maybe the concerning or interesting bit is that the near source and near wake activity seems to be actually quite important. Yeah. And that's the hardest bit to deal with. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we need to figure out ways to deal with that when we can chat about working together on that.
Thanks again.
Ooh, thank you. We have another question, Yong Ling, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Christina, for your nice presentation. Since you talked about the dispersion, so I'm wondering, could you briefly comment on the influence of the incoming boundary layer thermal instability? Seems you assuming a neutral boundary layer, right? So yeah, could you make some brief comment on that? And another more technical question about the P-leaf. So you are using 1 die or 2 die measurements? So that's my questions.
Okay. I will answer them in reversed order, because I think the second question is easier. We're just using rhodamine 6G dye for the PLIF. Okay. So yeah, just 1 dye. in just one source. Otherwise, it does get a bit tricky, doesn't it? And your second question was about the incoming flow and how important that is. And that is definitely a question that's on my radar and we're trying to answer. So in the water tunnel, we don't really play around with the stability. We just assume uniform temperature. But what we can do is play around with the incoming velocity profile and see how that affects the results. And so I'm hoping as we build the spires and the roughness, we'll be able to then have bespoke conditions and see how sensitive the results are to different thicknesses of boundary layer or different even profiles of boundary layer. But what I think was encouraging from the second case study was that the tall building seemed not too sensitive to the incoming flow. So again, it's going to be a case-specific thing, but maybe we can get away with using some simpler models when there are tall buildings. And I have a feeling that the incoming flow is going to be more important when you're looking at the near ground sort of activity.
Okay. Yep. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Do we have more questions from the audience? Oh, great. We have another hand up. Pim, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. My name is Pim Belay. I'm a postdoc at NTNU. Hi. I work with Jason Hurst, whom you know very well.
Oh, right on. Hi.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for your talk. Very interesting. Thanks for sharing. And also thanks for the organizers for hosting this in the evening, which allows me to join as well at for us reasonable time. So what I was curious about, I was thinking about your original problem or inspiration of the air pollution. So would you now say that having tall buildings would be beneficial in terms of reducing air pollution in cities, because this would create maybe more turbulence and enhance more spreading of the pollutant?
You are right on. Yes.
Okay.
So tall buildings have a great sort of chimney effect at sucking and ventilating any ground source pollution. But I mean, you can always get in traps of maybe localized hotspots or complicated things that's going on. So in general, I would say that the tall buildings definitely enhance this vertical flux and help to ventilate the city. Okay. But it depends where your source is, and it can get stuck sometimes.
Yeah, because I was thinking about that as well. What would happen if you put your source inside the city? Like, think of a big traffic jam or something.
That's a great idea.
And any speculations on this? Would you guess that did you still have this what you call vent effect, that this would perhaps pull up the pollutants, so to say?
I think at that point you need to zoom in at the sort of very micro scale and look at the near wake features of the building. And if you introduce the air pollution perhaps in the sort of recirculating cavity flow in the near wake, that could be problematic. But as soon as it reaches the rooftop shear layer, then you have great vertical fluxes.
Yeah, this goes back to the first part of your talk, I think, where you showed the different scales of where you can look at the problem, right, in between buildings or
you could see. Yeah, you could see that this is a problem though. Say you live in a high-rise building and you live in the top floors, and usually you open your windows to get fresh air. Well, actually, some of the air pollution is being carried all the way to the top of the building. So maybe you're not getting the fresh air that you think you're getting.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, thanks a lot once more.
Great. So we
have questions.
Getting lots of questions. It's great. We have another question from, I think, Ron. Go ahead and ask.
Hi. Hi, Christina. Very glad to join in. I saw your you posted this talk on Twitter, so I decided to join in.
Thank you.
From Israel. Yeah. It's a great presentation, I have to say. So you emphasized in your talk the effect of the tall building that they have. The tall building that creates the shear layer. This really seems to dominate the concentration field. But I'm wondering, what is the effect of the smaller buildings inside? So if you, for example, if you were to remove the smaller buildings, would it have a big effect on what's on the, let's say, the ground level concentration, or?
Well, funny you should say that. I sort of glossed over this point in my slides, but maybe I'll see if I can share my screen again. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again and then go back a few slides. And I'll erase all these scribbles. There we go. So when we tested the different scale models, we actually tested the models without the small buildings, without the low buildings, and only the tall buildings were in the model. You can see that it's essentially a smooth wall, and then the tall building is there. And this is because we couldn't get the same resolution on the low buildings when we have the scale as just because of the 3D printer we had. But it did let us test this question that you asked, is, well, how significant are the low buildings? And in this case, because the tall buildings are present, the low buildings did not have a very big effect. So if and it's not shown here, but essentially compare this picture with the previous pictures, the features are the same. You see the velocity coming, impacting the first building and being diverted upwards. And the presence of the low buildings that were in the previous model, it didn't change that too much.
Yeah, that's amazing because, sorry. Yeah, so I'm saying just the concentration maps, and I see that below the shear layer, there's almost like a fully mixed region all the way to the ground.
Like in here.
Yeah, exactly. So that's quite amazing.
Yeah, I mean, so the low buildings don't have too much effect right there.
Yeah, I mean, even if they were there, it's almost fully mixed. So there's nothing extra to do. Maybe.
Well, that was a good question, because we definitely asked that ourselves.
Yeah, I'm asking that because in my experiment, we did a similar experiment to Christina. And in there, we have a wing tunnel, and there we had two heights of roughness elements, big elements and smaller elements. And we were always trying to figure out what's the effect of having this two heights of a roughness layer. Well, anyway, thanks for the answer.
Cool, thank you. Any other questions coming from the audience? Cool. I might sneak in my own question then, which was thinking about basically the wind direction. So you had it all coming from the same direction in terms of the buildings. Is that kind of, I mean, I don't know a lot about kind of weather events, but is that reasonable? Like, do some cities see changes in the wind direction, or say gusts that come in that you would like to model somehow?
That is a good question, and some cities do have prevailing winds. So in Southampton, actually, the wind is usually from the coast, from the southwest. And so I think when we do our Southampton studies, it's going to be not too bad of an assumption, just looking at that dominant wind direction. We did test some other wind directions for this tall building case, and we find, again, it depends on which building hits the flow first, and that seems to dominate what's going on. And yeah, I guess for full meteorological studies, usually what you do is you take the wind rows, you model all the different wind directions, and then average them together. So we haven't done that. That's quite intensive when you start doing experiments for all the wind directions. but it is something to think about depending case by case.
Cool, thank you. All right, last chance for questions.
I might ask a quick question. Thanks for the talk. Just wondering, how is the resolution of your LES simulations?
I don't know all the answers for the LES simulations. So I'm working with Martin van Rooijk at Imperial College London, who's doing some LES based on the Dutch UDALIS code. And also Dr. Zhengtong Zi here at Southampton, who does some in-house LES. And yeah, I can get you in touch with them if you want to talk LES.
That's great. Thanks. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so I think we can all just thank our speaker once again for an excellent talk. Thanks, Christina. And I'll hopefully see you all next week for our next seminar. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.